You made a lot of points last time we were together on part one, and I didn't want to address all of them because some of them I felt lended to supplemental teachings that lended to. So I thought, let me just try to address, if possible, the most direct things pertaining directly to the serpent seed theory, and that's what I wanted to present tonight. So the first claim that I heard from you last time we were here was the Jerusalem Targum, which is, the scholars also call it the pseudo-Jonathan Targum, right? This being sometimes also called just the Aramaic Targum, because the word Targum is an Aramaic word. And so this was something that's been passed over through history, it wasn't put into a kind of a canonization process, but it was an actual translation, like we talked about, right? The word Targum just means translation.
Right.
And so this was a Jerusalem Targum is kind of the one that's most well known, if you will. And it's kind of from what I could understand, it's a little, you were saying that it was the oldest and the most authoritative. You think that this was the Targum that they brought from the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then it kind of carried forward throughout the years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was looking into the history and legitimacy of this Targum to see what was, what I could find that scholars said about it, and we're going to look at some of the text as well. So from the basic Britannica, the Encyclopedia Britannica, I found that there's a biblical translation is called a Targum in Aramaic, but it's a biblical translation as a general concept for the viewer, because a lot of people get kind of confused with the terminology. This is an art and practice of rendering a Bible into languages other than those it was originally written. Both Old and New Testaments have long histories of translations. We are aware of this. The reason I'm presenting this for the audience is so they know the difference between a Bible translation and an actual word-for-word translation. So sometimes people get kind of tripped up in thinking that any translation is word-for-word instead of being an interpretive translation like we see. And a lot of people don't realize this. When you go to like Bible Gateway or you go to like Bible Hub and you can cross-reference a whole bunch of Bible translations all at once, the reason why we have so many Bible translations is because copyright laws do not allow these publishers to, basically commit plagiarism. So if the translation that they're wanting to print and publish and sell for profit is too close to a previous translation, then they'll be, sued for copyright infringement or plagiarism. And so they have to come out with a different take. They rearrange some words, they pull out the thesaurus, and they put some different words in there. They most of them stick true to the meaning, but they just rearrange the sentence structure, put some different words in there, and try to make it seem different so they can get it published. Because the Bible sells 100 million copies a year. It's one of the most highest selling books in the world. In fact, I found out a few years ago, they don't even put the Bible on the New York Times bestseller list for books because it outsells every other book out there so greatly that it dwarfs all the other books. They don't even put it on that list anymore. It is the number one selling book in the world. So that's, as a result of that, people see an opportunity to make a new translation. But there is a difference between an actual translation of the Bible and a word for word. So like I have on the screen here, English, means man. In Spanish, it means hombre. And in Hebrew, it's ish, right? So this is a word for word translation between languages. The Bible is not this direct. Not always. There are some, what they call literal translations out there, but some of the Targums, i.e. translations, are not that direct. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. Genesis 1:1-2 in the Masoretic translation. It's, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. Earth was without form and void. Darkness was upon the face of the deep. The Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And then if you look at the Onkelos Aramaic translation of the same passage, it says, at the beginning, the Lord created the heavens and the earth. The earth was vacancy and desolation, solitary of the sons of men, void of every animal, and darkness was upon the face of the abyss. The spirit of mercies from before the Lord breathed upon the face of the waters. So we can see that there is a little bit more going on here. Now, supposedly, the Onkelos Aramaic translation was from the 2nd century CE, or AD. Some people understand AD. And the Masoretic, the Rabbinic Masoretic translation was approximately the 8th or 9th century CE. So the Onkelos is supposedly about 700 years before the traditional Masoretic that we all have for our modern English translations today. But then if we compare the Septuagint of the same passage, the first 2 verses of Genesis 1, it says, in the beginning, God made the heaven and the earth, but the earth was unsightly and unfurnished, and darkness was over the deep. The Spirit of God moved over the water. So we have here if you're following along, three very different descriptions. It is speaking about the same thing, but there's different words used as adjectives. There's different sentence structures. There's the most words as far as total words used in these two sentences. The 𝐚𝐽 Aramaic translation, wins that battle. It has the most. So we start to ask ourselves, we know that supposedly the Septuagint is the oldest, being the 3rd century BCE. There were multiple Septuagints commissioned by the rabbis in the 1st century. So therefore, even within that, there's variations that we see throughout history. But it's very much brief and to the point. But the translation of one of these Aramaic Targums that was used in Jerusalem in the 1st and 2nd century, it has a little bit more wording than some of these other translations. So this one is approved by rabbis. This was literally the Rabbinic Masoretic translation. Okay, so they came together in 8th, 9th century, and many of you guys remember our Milk and Meat live stream that we did a few weeks ago, where I go through history and I show all the places in the scriptures that the rabbis were literally tinkering with the scriptures to hide Yeshua, and they took out, changed, and altered many scriptures. And so as a result of that, they come up with their own translation. This is the Masoretic translation that we all know. This is the one from which most of our English Bibles are derived today. Also, the 𝐚𝐽 translation was a part of their rabbinic community. It was a part of their earlier versions of Scripture, because the majority of people in the 1st and 2nd century AD, they were using a version of the Septuagint. And this was widely known throughout the history of the Septuagint, that the rabbis did not like the Septuagint translation, which is why they started tinkering with it, try to make their own Greek translations so they could take out some of the stuff about Christ and hide Christ as much as possible. We did a whole show on that, guys. So go check that out. It was 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's proof that the Pharisees tried to hide Yeshua in Scripture. The Hebrew Union College and Jewish Institute of Religion, this was their take on these ideas of these targums, both the 𝐚𝐽, the Pseudo-Jonathan, and also the Jerusalem Targum, which apparently I found out there's three different Jerusalem Targums. Apparently number 2 and number 3 are fragmented heavily. So number 1 is pretty much the same, but I'll just read some of this here. It says, composed in the 2nd century, as far as the 𝐚𝐽 Targum, which is specifically on the Torah or the Pentateuch, supposedly composed in the 2nd century and in the land of Israel, but it was extradited and studied primarily in Babylon. So that's interesting, because it was moved around according to the religious leaders of the day. It's generally quite literal in its translation, but it's expansive in the poetic sections. Then the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, known as the Targum Jonathan in Rabbinic Bibles, but referred to as the Jerusalem I Targum in the Jasper's Dictionary of Rabbinic Hebrew and Aramaic, that was derived around the 8th century and CE, and its composition incorporated earlier Midrash and Targum material. So for many of you guys that are not aware, Midrash is commentary from the rabbis. We see a lot of Midrash in the Talmud. So this is one of those, right here, it's telling you that this particular Targum has some insertions in it that weren't originally there. So the Targum Jerusalem is used in land of Israel in the West, also built on the basis of the 𝐚𝐽, but adding extensive Midrash with exposition, was finalized in the Byzantine era. And then prior to the 1950s, it was known only from the fragments preserved in what's called the fragment Targums and fragmentary pages of the Cairo. So the prophets, and the reason why I included this down here from their commentary and their study of these Targums, is it says in the Targum Jonathan, roughly contemporary with the Targum 𝐚𝐽, but with extensive interpretive material. And this is not on the Torah. This is not Genesis through Deuteronomy, but these are on the books of the prophets. And it says these texts are especially noteworthy as representatives of rabbinic theology. And that's exactly what we'd be reading in the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, where it says it's incorporating earlier Midrash. That's what that means. It's their interpretations of their theology and their ideas, just like we were showing a few weeks ago, of how the rabbinic leaders, Jewish leaders of that day, were removing scriptures. In this case, they're adding in what is called didactic teachings, which is basically means they're trying to insert moral teachings into places in the text to help the reader get a grasp of what the rabbis think that it's saying. So that's it's called an admixture. And I'll just read here what the Britannica talks about as far as the Pseudo-Jonathan Targum. It says there are several Targums, translations of the Pentateuch. The Babylonian Targum is known as 𝐚𝐽, named after its reputed author. The Targum is Palestinian in origin, but it's early transferred to Babylon, where it was revised. So that means we do not have the original version of the 𝐦𝐚𝐧𝐭 Targum, and it received great authority. At a later date, probably not before the 9th century CE, it was re-exported back to Palestine, that's in the land of Judea, where it displaced other local Targums. And on the whole, 𝐽 is quite literal, but it shows a tendency to obscure expressions attributing human form and feelings to God. It's usually it faithfully reflects rabbinic exegesis. If the Jerusalem Targum, the Jerusalem Targum is a composite of the Old Palestinian Targum and an early version of the 𝐽 with an admixture of material from diverse periods. It contains much rabbinic material as well as homiletic, which is an art of speaking, the way it's written, meaning that the whole concept of saying that it is homiletic means that the sentence structure is being messed with and it's not the original. And didactic amplifications, these are insertions, like I said, to intend to teach moral ideas. There's evidence of great antiquity, but also much later material indicating Pseudo-Jonathan could not have received its present form before the Islamic period. Here in Jubilees 2:2, here's an example of rabbinic midrash and exposition that we can compare with something that is not accepted by rabbis compared to the Pseudo-Jonathan Targum that is accepted by rabbis. So here in Jubilees 2:2, where it says, "For on the first day he created the heavens which are above, and the earth and the waters, and all the spirits which serve before him." And then down below in the Jerusalem Targum, it says, "The Lord said to the angels who ministered before him, who had been created in the second day of the creation of the world." So we have a discrepancy between when the angels are created with Jubilees and the Jerusalem Targum. So is this potentially one of the places they inserted their own ideas, their own midrash? I would suggest it is. The Jubilees text is dated back in the BC, before these Targums were compiled and revised. And it's no wonder that the Jubilees Targum is rejected. The Jerusalem Targum is approved by the very people who compiled it. The second claim was the Book of Adam and Eve claims Adam and Eve had light vestures and not skin when they were removed. So what I looked into the book of First of Adam and Eve, I mean, we've studied it before. We considered doing on Honor of Kings season 3. We considered doing, several episodes on this. We just hadn't had a chance to get around to it yet. But in chapter 13, verse 6 and 7, I think, Zen, this is where you were getting this idea. And it does, I think in chapter 52, it does mention it again. There's some different ideas where it talks about further. But it says in verse 6, on thee, O Adam, while in my garden and obedient to me, did that bright light rest also. But when I heard of your transgression, I deprived you of that bright light. Yet of my mercy, I did not turn you into darkness, but I made you your body of flesh, over which I spread this skin, in order that it may bear cold and heat. All right, so this is where I would have a disagreement with what the first book of Adam and Eve teaches, being that Genesis, from my understanding, tells us Adam and Eve were given flesh from the get-go, from the very beginning, before they were even put in the yard, when they were raised from the dust. As Genesis 2:7 says, that God formed man from the dust. And then in verse 23, when Adam is now looking at Eve, who was made from his rib, he turns to her and says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." So therefore, I would feel like that's a discrepancy. Same thing with Jubilees chapter 3. It would be a discrepancy with the first book of Adam and Eve's claim, because it says in chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, that he built up the flesh in its stead where he pulled the rib from Adam to make Eve. And in turn, he says the same thing, that she's bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Jubilees also goes on to explain that Adam and Eve were not made on the same day. In fact, Adam was made on day 6 of week 1, and Eve was made on day 6 of week 2. And that would be a discrepancy of what book of Adam and Eve said they're made on the same day together, I think. So Jubilees chapter 3, verse 8 through 9 goes on to say, and after Adam had completed 40 days in the land where he'd been created, we brought him into the Garden of Eden to till it, to keep it. But his wife they brought in on the 80th day. After this, she entered into the garden. And then the next following verses, 10, 11, and 12, go on to explain why they waited to bring Adam and Eve into the garden. And it was literally because of Leviticus 12, the law of those going through a purification process. And Adam had to wait 40 days. The female Eve had to wait 80 days. And that's why they were not created on the same day, and they were not brought into the garden in bodies of light. They had real bones and real flesh from the start to be brought in there, as I can see from Genesis and Jubilees. Also in 1 Corinthians 15, 45 through 47, it says, "So it's also written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural. then the spiritual. The first man is from the earth, earthy. The second man is from heaven. That's going off this premise of that I feel attaches to Genesis 2 and Jubilees 3, that Adam was formed from the dust of the earth. He was not in some sort of light body, and he did not have skin formed for him after he transgressed. He had skin from the very beginning. So claim number 3, Cain and Abel were twins. Cain was Satan's child. Abel was Adam's child. Eve was impregnated by both Satan and Adam on the same day. So just for the viewer I'm going to try to say that one more time. So this was part of the claim of the serpent seed theory, was that Cain and Abel were twins, and that Cain was as a result of Satan mixing with Eve, and then Abel was a result of Adam mixing with Eve, and though she was pregnant with 2 different seeds on the same day. And we're going to look at that real quick. So the claims of all the books that I could find that actually talk about Cain and Abel being born, only the Jerusalem Targum is the one that claims that Cain and Abel were twins. In the Masoretic Genesis, it doesn't say it. In the Septuagint Genesis, it doesn't say it. In Jubilees, it definitely doesn't say it. And I'm going to go into that in a few more minutes in my last point. The first book of Adam and Eve itself doesn't say it. So in the first book of Adam and Eve, it actually says that Cain had a sister as his twin when they were born, and then Abel had a sister later when he was birthed. So there were 2 sets of twins. Cain and his sister were one set. Abel and another sister were another set, and they were born at different time periods. And then Jasher also does not talk about them being twins either, with Cain and Abel being birthed. The fourth claim, that Adam was 60 cubits tall, and this lended into a couple of different ideas, but I just wanted to hit this one kind of quickly because there's a couple of large issues with this kind of concept. Now, I don't doubt that mankind could have been taller, right? We know that it's possible with the Nephilim for human flesh to grow tall and be big with giants. But was Adam actually of that stature? I know the Apocalypse of Abraham talks about them being of great stature, but specifically 60 cubits tall. From what I heard in the presentation last time, you said that this came from the Quran, and so this is
Gospel of Bartholomew.
Yeah, I couldn't find it in the Gospel of Bartholomew. Maybe you can send me the text afterwards. I just could not find. I read through several versions. I could not see it. So I did find this information in the Quran, in the Hadith, and so that's, of course, most of the viewers would not take the Quran as a validated source, especially because Allah is considered a different God. Yahweh created Adam. Muhammad's not a prophet of Yahweh. Islam rejects Yeshua as the son of God, the Messiah. So that source I wouldn't take. But you did mention the Quran last time. So I think you mentioned it right after the Gospel of Bartholomew, which is why I searched both. But basically, what I see here in Genesis 6, 14, and 15, it gives us the dimensions of Noah's Ark. And it says the length of the ark was 300 cubits. And from what and correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that you were making the argument that Adam was of this stature, and they all were until Noah. And then after Noah, that's when they started decreasing in size and lifespan. And so if that was the case, the length of the ark would not facilitate men of that size. It's only 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits broad, and 30 cubits in height, which here's a visual representation of what that would look like. We would have some issues with them actually getting in the boat if mankind was anywhere near that size, as well as the food that they would need to take with them and the sustenance and the other animals. The fifth claim, the serpent had sex with Eve. So this is pretty much the crux of the claim. And I looked into 1 Enoch chapter 10, and the reason why I'm bringing this up for the viewer is because I don't see in any of the texts, and I'm going to go over this in just a minute, I don't see personally the wording that supports it. And I'm going to go over the actual wording of Genesis 4:1 as you did earlier or a few weeks ago in my subsequent points here. But the reason why I'm showing this subtitle up here that says the punishment doesn't fit the crime is because the other angels that we see in the rebellious watchers in the book of Enoch, who actually took wives and had children by them, they receive a specific punishment for doing that, directly related to doing that. And 𝐦𝐤𝐬, whom you and I both agree is the one that was there in the garden with Adam and Eve, seducing them, which I don't think is a literal sexual seduce. I think it's a beguiling. It's a trickery seduce, as the word can be used for. And it says that he got a different punishment. And we see that both of their punishments are not enacted until, years after they're actually sentenced, right? So after the proclamation of their punishment is spoken by the Lord and communicated through the angels, through Enoch to the watchers, that their punishment doesn't happen that day. So it's communicated that 𝐦𝐤𝐬, here in I think it's verse 8 and 9, that the Lord said to Raphael, bind 𝐦𝐤𝐬 hand and foot, cast him into the darkness, make an opening in the desert which is in to dwell, and cast him there, place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever. Now I also put in parentheses, and that is my insertion. I just want everyone to know this. The word forever in the book of Enoch is in a loose English translation of the Hebrew word, and also the Paleo Hebrew word olam, which is an idea for a long span of time and age, a long duration, and it also can mean eternity. You have to look at the context to know how that's being used. Just like a lot of Hebrew words, you got to look at the context. And so they're told to put him in there, let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light. And then on the great day of judgment, he shall be cast into the fire. Now, we don't actually see that come true until Revelation 20. He's put in the hole in the ground for 1,000 years, and then he's pulled out, thrown in the lake of fire. In the meantime, he's running around everywhere. But the other angels that were with him, specifically in verse 11, the Lord said unto Michael, go to 𝐚𝐽𝐳 and his associates, and who have united themselves with women, so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. So we have 𝐦𝐤𝐬 being differentiated from the other rebellious watchers. They're all rebellious. They all taught mankind things they shouldn't have. But specifically this sin of taking a woman and having a wife out of her and impregnating her and causing a child, the punishment is not given to 𝐦𝐤𝐬 for that. He's given a totally different punishment. It doesn't say that he did this. It just separates unto these other watchers and explains that they did it, and that they are going to be, here's the punishment that they get is, he goes on to say in 15, 1 through 7, he answered and said to me, and I heard his voice, fear not, Enoch, you righteous man and scribe of righteousness, approach here and hear my voice. Go say to the watchers of heaven who have sent you to intercede for them, you should intercede for men and not men for you. Wherefore have you left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your sons? So again, it's just kind of expounding on the actual crime that these particular angels did. And then we see that reverberated in Jude 1:6, the angels who did not keep their own domain, abandoned their proper abode. He has kept them in eternal bonds under darkness for the great day of judgment. The punishment is spelled out, which angels did that punishment, and then what type of judgment they're beginning, what type of punishment. And that lines up with 1 Enoch 18, where he goes on in verses 11 through 6 and also 19:1. He says, I saw a deep abyss with the columns of fire, and among them I saw columns of fire fall, which were beyond measure alike toward the heavens and toward the depth. And beyond that abyss I saw a place which had no firmament of the heaven above, and no firmly founded earth beneath it. There was no water upon it, and no birds, but it was waste and horrible place. I saw there 7 stars like great burning mountains. And to me, when I inquired regarding them, the angel said, this place is the end of heaven and earth, and this has become a prison for the stars and the host of heaven. And the stars which roll over the fire are they which have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in the beginning of their rising, because they did not come forth at their appointed times. And he was wroth with them, and bound them till the time when their guilt should be consummated, even for 10,000 years. And Uriel said unto me, here shall stand the angels who have connected themselves with women, and their spirits, assuming many different forms, are defiling mankind, and shall lead them astray into sacrificing to demons as gods. Here shall they stand till the great day of judgment, in which they shall be judged till they're made an end of. And so that lines up with what we read earlier, 8 chapters earlier in Enoch as well. And 𝐦𝐤𝐬 not part of that crowd. Here in Job chapter 1, 6 and 7, we actually see that 𝐦𝐤𝐬, who's called Mastema, he's also called 𝐦𝐤𝐤𝐤. He's also, he has several different names. He's called the Serpent, the Dragon, the Wicked One. He's the Evil One. Job 1, 6 and 7 says, when the Lord asked Satan, where do you come from? Satan answered and said, from roaming about on the earth and walking around on it. So this is where the actual punishment laid out in chapter 10 of Enoch. It separates Azazel and the other angels according to what they did. Their punishments fit their crime. Azazel did not take a wife and did not impregnate anybody. And he's still out running around, as we know, Revelation 12:17, the dragon, right? He goes off to make war with the rest of the children who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. We're dealing with that actively today. He's the same Satan that's tempting Yeshua in Matthew 4 and Luke 4. Also in Revelation 20, this is the moment where his punishment is finally enacted. And this is, then I saw an angel come down from heaven, holding the keys of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. Claim number 6. Because Cain is not mentioned in the genealogies, he must be Satan's child. That was kind of the argument that I heard from you, right?
That is one of them, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess this one's not very complicated rebuttal. It's simply just Abel's not mentioned either. Neither are any of the other children of Adam and Eve in the genealogies. It just skips right to Seth. So that would be an assumption, in my opinion, because Genesis 5:4 is a place where it mentions that Adam had many other sons and daughters. None of them are named. It's only, we only get kind of the big three, so to speak. Adam, we only get Cain and Abel and Seth. So Cain goes off, we get his whole genealogy, he does his own thing. Abel's killed, and then we get Seth and his genealogy, and we see, him flourish. Also in Jubilees 4:10, it says that Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she bare yet 9 sons. And this is after Cain and Abel are birthed, which I'm going to go over here in just a minute. So I just, to me, that would not be something that would substantiate the theory just because Cain and Abel are not mentioned in the genealogies. Claim number 7, and this is the last one, that Satan fathered Cain through Eve. So not just the simple claim that Satan had sex with Eve, but simply that he fathered Cain through Eve. And this is in Genesis 4:1. This is the Jerusalem Targum, and this is one that I think that you lean on the most to support this theory in this particular verse, where it says, "And Adam knew Hava," that's Eve for the listener. Adam knew Hava, his wife, who had desired the angel, and she conceived, and she bare Cain. And she said, "I've acquired a man, the angel of the Lord." And so I think what you were saying was that because of the insertion of the words, "who had desired the angel," and that's where we don't see that in Genesis or Septuagint, the Masoretic or the Septuagint, or we don't see that in Jubilees. We only see that in this Jerusalem Targum. And that's personally where I would suggest this is the midrash that's been inserted, like I showed from the earlier slides in point number 1. And because the Jerusalem Targum was a mixture of the fragments that they had from the Jerusalem Targum, as well as the Onkelos Targum, and it was compiled and created in the 8th century AD. And that it was also, at that time, they inserted their own midrash and didactic teachings into the texts as you read it. So that's why it's called revised by historians. And that's why we don't see it in the other texts. And it could be why some of the canonization processes didn't include it as a part of the Bible, because they knew that it was rabbinical midrash that was inserted in there, which is basically interpretive exegesis. Genesis 1:12-13, in the book of Jasher, it says, "Adam knew his wife Eve, and she bore 2 sons and 3 daughters. And she called the name of the firstborn Cain, saying, I've attained a man from the Lord. And the name of the other she called Abel, for she said, in vanity we come into the earth, and in vanity we should be taken from it." And like I said, this is not, there is no mention here of the serpent taking Eve. I don't even agree with Jasher, to be honest with you, brother. I'm using these first 2 I'm using here. I don't think that these are texts that I personally would use to make a case for stuff because of some of the issues with their manuscripts and history. And so that's why I put these 2 up first. But the next ones that I'm presenting, I still honestly don't even agree with the first book of Adam and Eve, but I just wanted to show that when it comes to the actual storyline of, did the serpent actually take Eve and make a child with her? In first book of Adam and Eve 54, verse 5 and 6, it says, "And God looked at his maidservant Eve and delivered her, and she brought forth her firstborn son, and with him a daughter. Then Adam rejoiced at Eve's deliverance, and also over the children she had borne him. And Adam ministered unto Eve in the cave until the end of 8 days, when they named the son Cain and the daughter Leluah." So this book directly telling us that Cain and Abel were not born at the same time. And it also has no mention of the serpent taking Eve. It's not the same storyline that you presented. But in the Masoretic and in the Septuagint of Genesis 5:4, excuse me, I'm sorry, this is a typo. This is actually Genesis 4:1. Guys, I'll change this before I upload them to Patreon, but this is Genesis 4:1. It says, the Masoretic says, now the man, and the reason why I put this in parentheses, guys, because this is the Hebrew word that they used in the Masoretic for this verse in Genesis 4:1 that says, now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. That word in the Hebrew, the man, is not ish, but it's the compilation of wu ha-adam, which is where we get the article the, that's the ha. The word Adam is a word that's also used for man. So that's why it's saying it's not, it doesn't say Adam, and it doesn't say the angel of the Lord. It's literally saying the man had relations with his wife, Eve. This is also a point of context that I think is contradictory with the first book of Adam and Eve, where it claims that they didn't get married until like 7 or 8 months after they were out of the garden. But Jubilees in Genesis suggests that they were already married. Jubilees directly tells you they're already married in chapter 3. I think it's verse 30. So here in the Masoretic in Genesis 4:1, I don't see the actual wording. The text just literally does not say that the serpent took Eve and had sex with her and created a child from her. Also in the Septuagint version of Genesis 4:1, it said, Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and brought forth Cain, and said, I've gained a man through God. So also missing the idea of the serpent taking her. Jubilees 3:15, 32 through 34, and then also 4 and 1. So this is the latter end of Jubilees 3, as well as the beginning of Jubilees 4. It says, in the first week of the first Jubilee, Adam and his wife were in the Garden of Eden for 7 years, tilling and keeping it. And we gave him work, and we instructed him to do everything that's suitable for tillage. Okay, so that's verse 15. It's telling you a time frame that Adam and Eve were in the garden for 7 years before they were kicked out. And that's where it says in the later verses that on the anniversary of the day they were brought in there, 7 years to the day, that's when the serpent came up and deceived them. Verse 32 through 34 of the same chapter, it says, and on the new moon of the 4th month, Adam and his wife went forth from the Garden of Eden, and they dwelt in the land of Eldah, in the land of their creation. And Adam called the name of his wife Eve. And they had no son till the first Jubilee. And after this, that's 49 years, he knew her. And in the 3rd week, in the 2nd Jubilee, that's 21 years, she gave birth to Cain. And in the 4th, she gave birth to Abel. And in the 5th, she gave birth to her daughter Awan. And that's Jubilees 4:1. So from these texts in Jubilees, it tells us, just for the viewer that's walking, many of the people don't realize what a Jubilee is and why the book of Jubilees is called the book of Jubilees. So how long is a Jubilee of years? It's 49 years. What makes a Jubilee is 7 weeks of years. So basically you're dividing 49 years by 7, and that's how they break it up into 7 increments. And they call each of those increments a week of years. So what's a week of years? That's 7 years. So 7 years times 7 is a Jubilee. So this is where we get 7 weeks of years equals 1 Jubilee. So if we go back to this text in Jubilees chapter 3, in the beginning of chapter 4, it tells us that they, Adam and Eve, had no son till the first Jubilee. So that's 49 years in. And after that, 21 years after that, she conceived Cain and gave birth to Cain. So if we do the math, Adam and Eve were in the garden for 7 years. Adam and Eve were deceived by the serpent at the anniversary of that. And at the beginning of the 8th year, they were removed from the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve did not conceive in the first Jubilee, which is 49 years. And in fact, they didn't even conceive until 21 years into the second Jubilee, which would be year 71 of creation. And technically, that means it would be 63 years after they were expelled from the garden that Cain was conceived and birthed by Eve. And all the texts that I could find directly tell us that Adam knew his wife and she conceived Cain.